Welcome, everyone. We're just going to give it a minute or so for everyone to check into our Water UCI Speaking of Water series, and then I'm going to introduce our colloquium for today and our speakers. All right, we've got a good crowd coming in. Good to see you all. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Well, welcome, everyone. I'm Dave Feldman. It's my privilege to serve as the Director of Water UCI, and I want to welcome you to our latest colloquium with our Water UCI Speaking of Water series. It's entitled Rapid Response to the Norfolk Southern Chemical Spill and Chemical Fires in East Palestine, Ohio. It's my pleasure to welcome Andrew Welton, a professor of civil and environmental engineering at Purdue University, and Paula Coelho, who is a PhD student first year at the same university, Purdue University. After a little bit of introduction, I want to mention the fact that after Andrew and Paula's talk, there will be an opportunity for Q&A. There is a Q&A box. You can put your questions in there as the talk proceeds, and we'll go through as many of those as time permits. I should also remind you that, like all of our colloquia, this virtual colloquium is going to be recorded for posterity on our homepage. Before we begin, I want to make a special thanks to the Speaking of Water supporters. You see them on our website, and I'd like to invite you to contribute. We welcome your support as well for future colloquia. And last but not least, I want to thank the Associate Director of Water UCI, Shannon Roback, for all of her planning and organizing of the speaker series this year. All right, so without further ado, we know that in February of this year, a Norfolk Southern train derailed in East Palestine, Ohio, launching off a series of fires and ultimately explosions of hazardous materials. Chemical spill and fires released hazardous materials into Ohio and Pennsylvania through both air and waterways. East Palestine has a population, so you know, of about 4,500, and ultimately contamination was monitored and entered states with more than 37 million people. Andrew Welton, who has been doing research on this, I mentioned, is a professor of civil and environmental and ecological engineering at Purdue University, has more than 20 years of experience in the infrastructure and public health disciplines, and he's often been called into nationally significant disasters to provide support. And Paula Coelho, who is a first-year PhD student in the Environmental and Ecological Engineering program at Purdue, is the lead student for the disaster response activities at Purdue. Her BS in Environmental and Sanitary Engineering is from the Universidade Federal do Pará, and she previously worked as an engineer in the municipal and consulting sectors. Paula and Andrew, it's all yours. Look forward to your remarks.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Shannon, and everybody else for listening in and for the invitation to be here. What I'm attempting to do is share my screen. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. So we'll just get started here. So thanks again for the invitation. And this is an evolving response in recovery, and more information is coming out by the day still, not just out of our lab, but other labs around the country and East Palestine, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. So just to kind of give you a little bit of background about what we do here. For the last 10 or 15 years or so, I've been involved with disaster response for communities that are impacted by disasters, whether they be households calling for help about, is my water safe? What do I need to test for? How do I make my home safe? Or called by municipal directors, utility directors, Governor of West Virginia, and others asking, how do we keep our community safe or return some sense of normalcy by understanding the environmental health risks to us and remove them. And so we've done this nationally, and we've gone to West Virginia previously, where we help communities impacted by the Freedom Industries chemical spill in the Elk River in 2014. They had toxic water delivered to their homes, affecting over 330,000 people in West Virginia, resulting in a 9-day water ban. And that was really our first kind of look into the need for scientific support after these types of disasters when it comes to water safety and building safety. So together, what we do is we get our colleagues together, students together, and generally we just get in a van and drive in to the community to help. This is the team that went into West Virginia years ago. We also helped folks in California after the Camp Fire in 2018, where 14,000 homes were destroyed, and the drinking water systems were contaminated in some places with hazardous waste scale contamination of benzene and other contaminants. And so we worked with UC Berkeley and Chico State University and Butte College, and helped communities understand how to read water testing lab reports, how to take a sample, what types of things you want to ask laboratories as well, in addition to all the directed targeted research that we were doing. One of the third disasters that we've been involved with was the Marshall Fire in Boulder County, Colorado in 2021, where we helped health departments and local municipality understand how to find contamination, what types of things they should tell their population to do and to take action to protect themselves. And this was a really positive experience because Colorado really picked up the baton and took the lead in protecting their community. And so here is just a couple other students in postdoc who was used to be a student here at Purdue University, Dr. Christian Lay. She's at UC Boulder. And again, we kind of just get in cars, get in vans and show up and start helping how we can. And so the next kind of disaster, which is the Ohio, Pennsylvania chemical spill and fires, involved Paula. And I'm going to let her introduce herself real quick before I take back the mic and continue.
Yeah, so I'm Paula. I'm from Brazil. I don't have that amount of background as Dr. Welton has, especially in disaster. I have a bachelor's degree in sanitary and environmental engineering in Brazil. And since I'm a first year PhD student here, I'm working on microplastic study in drinking water. And this is the first disaster that I got involved with, which is the East Palestine Ohio chemical spill disaster. And it's been really interesting to get to know firsthand how those things happens here, how everything is management, the public management, the quality monitor, the water quality monitoring, and everything. That's pretty much it.
Thanks, Paula. So Paula took a class that I teach here called Disasters and Emergencies. Primarily that's at Purdue University, where we bring in speakers from across the world that either have been victims of disasters, or their leaders, executives, or their companies responding to disasters, and trying to piece together, how things can work well and what types of questions you need to ask and how to do that. So Paula was in that class, and then she got drafted this semester to come out in the field and kind of chip in. So we're talking now about the chemical spill in Ohio, and what happened was on February 3rd, a train wrecked in East Palestine, Ohio, and there were chemical fires that were started immediately. And so 3 days later, the vinyl chloride train cars that were there, these rail cars, 5 of them were set on fire. And even though the night before on a Sunday, only 1 of them was supposed to be set on fire. So the next day, 5 of them were set on fire, and there was concern about the chemical plume moving through the community and affecting people. So there was a 1-mile evacuation order established for the 1 rail car that was supposed to be set on fire. But as I mentioned, 5 rail cars were set on fire. And so this is the picture on the right is a model that the governor of Ohio showed on TV, where they thought the chemicals from the plume would go when they set them on fire for the one rail car. And you can also see these arrows going from right to left on your screen, and there's a creek like right next to the railroad tracks. And that's where chemicals spilled into the creek and then started flowing from right to left or east to west, and then down towards the Ohio River. So this was a pretty traumatic and significant incident. It was significant just from a chemical spill standpoint. It was less than a mile from the border of Pennsylvania. So there was cross-jurisdictional concerns where chemicals in one state, because of the decisions there, would move into another state. And there was a lot of problems with understanding what exactly was on the train during the incident response. So firefighters and other responders showed up to the site, and they didn't really have an idea about what was actually burning. And some of them didn't have appropriate PPE based on public reports. But the US EPA, the federal US EPA, posted this information online, which lists a number of different materials that Norfolk Southern reported to them as being on the train. So we put together this kind of like overview of a timeline here, and we put together this timeline because it's still coming together. But if we're starting on February 6th, when the vinyl chloride rail cars were set on fire, February 8th, the evacuation order was lifted, and officials said that, quote, the air was basically what it was prior to the train crash, unquote. A lot of the air testing was being conducted in the middle of the street, outdoors, not inside people's homes where they were headed. And then on February 13th, the state of Ohio told everybody to use bottled water until water testing of the drinking water wells for the community were tested. The drinking water wells, there was a municipal water system in East Palestine that had groundwater wells, and then there were a number of different rural households that had their own private drinking water wells right next to the creeks that received the brunt of the liquid contaminated waste. There was about 3,500 fish found dead early on. And I believe it was the fire chief, somebody said that they were detecting hundreds of chemicals in the air, and that they were also seeing a haze and odor after the fires were put out. So this haze or particulates in the air when the fire was put out. On February 15th, the state of Ohio said that the municipal drinking water was found to be safe, but it turns out that that statement was made based on water testing data by Norfolk Southern, not necessarily by the governor's staff themselves. Then between the 14th and the 17th of February, people started reporting illnesses, headaches, nausea, and symptoms after they started going back into their homes, where much of the air testing was not conducted. On February 22nd, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania Health Department issued home cleaning guidance that warned people to open their windows when they vacuumed to kind of let the chemicals leave their home. And then February 23rd, the state of Ohio starts conducting their own testing with their own staff and not relying solely upon Norfolk Southern, who was the principal responsible party for the chemical spill and chemical fires. On February 23rd, Ohio came out publicly and said, well, now they believe that there's at least 4,300 fish found dead in the creeks. And then CDC thankfully started sending a team in to do some public health assessments. And so this is kind of the ideology of how this response occurred. We showed up in February 25th to 27th to do chemical testing of drinking water after we were contacted by community and residents. And we did this because at the time that we showed up, the state, the county, the federal agencies had little to no information available to make the decisions that were being made. And what I mean by that is that the air is safe, the water is safe, were the common statements, but it turns out a lot of the drinking water data wasn't posted online. And so people just had to trust that the agencies all knew what they were doing. The county health department for the first time started posting private drinking water well testing results online February 25th. On March 1st, the US EPA warns people finally not to let kids play near the streams or creeks. We saw, as Paula will show you, people were close to these creeks, and there was these chemical discharge points that were set up to kind of strip the chemicals out of the creeks, but they were pumping them into the air where people were. And then there was a number of situations where people became ill, and this was being publicly reported, but separately, the US EPA was sharing data saying that the air is safe, that there's no health risks to the population. And so we basically, through a series of interactions with the community and our own experiences, we were able to understand some of what was going on and started making recommendations to the community as well as to the agencies involved about how to fix their disaster response. Now, this slide here is from Texas A&M University and Carnegie Mellon University, and they posted this on Twitter. And this is a great team that went in, that started driving around a van with a PTRMS unit to characterize the chemical composition of the air in East Palestine. And I would refer you to them for the depth and context of this slide. But really what I want to show you is that there's other teams that are going in that are doing good work, trying to help responders, agencies, and the population better understand what the chemical risks are and what people are exposed to. So as we were hearing about things here at Purdue, we got involved, and we sent some emails out to folks here at Purdue and said, hey, if you're interested, if we bring stuff back, would you analyze it for XYZ chemicals or these contaminants? We had a number of people at Purdue step forward and said, yeah, we're in, we'll help do, work at no cost to the community as long as we can help them. And then a professor at Notre Dame also joined us. And so that's kind of what led us to this larger study here, which is a volunteer-based study where we went in, we did testing. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share, slide this over to Paula now, and she can share some of the results.
Yeah, so move on to the results that we had during the time that we got involved into this project. So far, we did four visits to the site, and the first one was 3 weeks after the accident. And we have so far 18 locations for creek water samples. We also have wells water samples, 15 at all in the total of them. And we also have soil samples from the creeks. We did wide samples for outdoor homes, and we also interviewed some homeowners just to check like what is their perspective about what happened, about the accident, about how things are ongoing after the accident as well. So I cannot go to the next one, Dr. So as I said, we went there 3 weeks after the accident, and this figure here, the elephant figure, represents basically when you have a critical situation and you have different perspectives from different people. So that's what you need to see, like in this scenario, in the chemical spill in Ohio, you need to see like what is the surface water quality, what is the groundwater quality, air quality as well, and modeling. So everyone has different perspective about this same situation. So you need to consider all these different perspectives in order to be sure what you're gonna test for, what you're gonna test for, and where and how you're gonna do those tests. So Purdue is involved in doing different analysis for those samples that I mentioned before that we have. So we are analyzing water pH, temperature. We are also analyzing VOCs, SVOCs, PFAS, TPH. We are seeing metals and ions on those samples. It's important to highlight here that we are since different labs at Purdue and out of Purdue is involved in this project, we are seeing those other perspective about how we're gonna see all these different compounds in the water. So this year I want to share with you the sheen that we could see at the first time that we went to the site. So this sheen is, we did the wipe samples from the sheen in order to see what is the composition of the sheen. Yeah, you can move, go to the next one. So I want to share with you this quick video about the aeration that what is happening. Norfolk Southern installed in the park in East Palestine. And the problem with this aeration is that we don't know what they put into the air, because the main point about this aeration is to volatilize all those compounds. The problem is they don't know what is the composition of the water, what they are pulling into the air. And in the first trip that we went 3 weeks after the accident, this aeration was in the middle of downtown, really like a couple feet away from where people lived. So people were breathing all those chemicals they were blowing into the air. Even when we went there, we also faced some I'd say health problems, because because we got exposed with those compounds, and we didn't know like how dangerous they were. Like, but then the next trip we could see that they moved this aeration to another site out of the of downtown, and they put it in the middle of a park. So that's the location what you can see in this video right now. So this is what we saw at the first trip. So the creek, as Dr. Alton said, it is really close to the accident site. So so the creek is contaminated with those sheen, as you can see in this figure. The sheen it's contaminating the creek water, and the aeration is sucking the contamination from the creek and is blowing into the air, and we don't know what is going into the air. But Norfolk Southern also installed some dams downtown alongside the creek, and they put some sorbent pads and boom in order to collect those sheen. But what is unknown is how this creek water is contaminating the groundwater and eventually the wells water, and the wells water that is going to be consumed by homeowners who live really close to the accident, especially because some of the wells water that we saw, that we collect some samples, are really like less than 100 feet from the creek. So this represents, we did some we are comparing some different compounds which different agencies are looking for in the water. So they are analyzing different compounds, and for surface water, municipal water, and wells water, because downtown, the majority of the homes the source of water is municipal water, and the people who live farther away from downtown has wells water, private wells water. And so as you can see here, the different agencies, different Ohio is testing different compounds for the water. But we are not showing here what Norfolk Southern is testing for. So yeah, we have what is the locations for the creek that we collected. So you can see in the red point, yeah, the spill site, and the red circle around it represents the 1 mile of evacuation that happened after the accident. And we collected some contaminated creek, and we also collected some background creek water samples. And the problem is what we think it is a background, like in Darlington and Negley, which is kind of far from the accident. We also had received some complaints about homeowners who had some health issues after the accident, like for skin or water contamination. And what we assume is the reason for that is the plume of the contaminated plume that we don't know yet. What is the real plume that went the explosion went? So since we don't know, it is unclear what is the real background and what is the part of the city, what is the part of the neighborhoods that is really contaminated. So we summarized some of the Ohio EPA analysis, because Ohio EPA required Norfolk Southern to collect and analyze creek water samples. And the first sample that they did for the contaminated site was in February 9th. But the background, the first analysis that they did was in February 4th. We don't know, we are not sure like why they did the background, and the samples for the contaminated areas in those different dates. But as you can see here, just as I mentioned, the background is about the plume, like how the plume for the air went to spreading the contamination. So the background here in the last column, you can see that Norfolk Southern is also pointing some contamination in the background samples that they did. And they also had some real high concentration for western locations from the spill site, and from the eastern location from the spill site. So in this table here, I'm showing you what was the highest concentration that happened in those dates for the first analysis that they did for each of these compounds here. So we developed the methods, and we target for contaminants, and we collecting background creek water samples. So this is the background that we collected, that I just show you the blue dots, the blue pinpoints in the map. So which match with the unclear about what is the direction that the plume of the contamination went, because even though it's the background, we also found some contamination in at least one of those samples. So this is the preliminary results for the first trip that we did in February 26. And it is from the spill site, as you can see, the blue line represents the Sulphur Run Creek, which is really close to the spill site, and the yellow line represents the another run, which is Leslie Run. And some of the results, such as the Creek 1 Shin, the butoxyethanol, 2-butoxyethanol, I compare here what was our result at Purdue and what was the result from Ohio EPA. And in some of those results, we had higher concentrations, and in some others, Ohio EPA had higher concentration, but yet it is still unclear what is the Shin composition of that we could see in the creek water. So as one example of what I just mentioned to you, 2-butoxyethanol at the same point for February 27, which is the same that we collected. This we can make the comparison that compare the different results, different concentration results. And in this case, we had higher concentration than Ohio EPA, but it does not mean that it is just unclear what is the condition that Ohio EPA did this, collected the sample, analyzed the sample, what was the approach, and like some other things that might influence as well, like what is the time of the day that they collected, what is the sample procedure that they did, what is it raining at the time, or creek turbulence may also influence the results. At the time, we asked to Ohio EPA direction. Purdue asked Norfolk Southern what was the sampling plan, but they did not reply to us. That's why we are not sure like what was the procedure for the sampling and the analysis. So and so we can just compare the results, which sometimes it's different. So as expected, contaminated levels decreased over time, but Shin and odor was still present 7 weeks after the accident. So for some samples, we had 2 or 3 samples for the same location. And as you can see, for the same compounds, whether the concentration decreased or wasn't detected by our method. So, but yet that's why we say that is the composition of this Shin, it is still unknown, because we can see the Shin, we can that is still a strong odor next to the creek in the site, but we don't know what is the composition of it, because for the method that we used, we didn't see, we could see the decrease in the concentration of those compounds that we are looking for. We also looked for wells water, and we analyzed 15 wells, and but no contaminant associated with the spill were detected. Some of the wells that we analyzed were really close to the contaminated creek. Some of them were like less than 100 feet from the creek. And we are not sure if in long term, this groundwater of this creek or this well will eventually get contaminated. This is an unclear information for us. And other analysis that we did was also ions and metals, but those results are still on the way. So we're gonna share those results and later.
All right, thank you, Paula. So just to kind of round this out, some of the other challenges that were addressed during the spill, Arsenco, which is basically an entity that monitors water quality from tributaries that go into the Ohio River as well as the Ohio River, was initiated, and Arsenco started doing sampling as the plume moved from the yellow star there on the screen downwards to the Ohio River in past 3 different states, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Indiana. And in response to the contamination, ATSDR set up screening levels, these temporary exposure limits for contaminants in drinking water. If they were going to be in drinking water, what levels would they be safe? And so they came up with this list here, but you know, by the recommendation of the US EPA, the incident commander, we reached out to ATSDR twice to figure out what these screening levels are, and they haven't responded. And why that matters is because a number doesn't mean anything if you don't know how it's derived. So are these ingestion only screening levels? Do these include bathing and inhaling, you know, the contaminants or whatnot? That's the challenge that we encountered in 2014 after the West Virginia chemical spill with Freedom Industries, where the screening levels didn't consider all the factors associated with the exposures. So we don't know here in Ohio, but we're still waiting to hear back from ATSDR. Another kind of diagram we put together is this. And so if this is overwhelming, try to be the household at the very bottom. So the households at the very bottom and businesses are the ones that are most affected. And these are all the entities that are moving around the area, either in Ohio, Pennsylvania, or elsewhere, having a role in the disaster response recovery or influencing the process. And so there's a lot of different moving parts associated with it. But what you don't see here is a feedback loop. You don't see where the disaster and incident response is receiving feedback from the households that are impacted and then adapting their response. This is a government-directed recovery. This is not community-engaged recovery. We also are actually, Chris D'Angelo from the Huffington Post, a journalist, came across this document. And it turns out one of the reasons why different agencies weren't testing for all the chemicals that were spilled on the train is because in their discussions with creating a water sampling plan early on during the disaster response, they didn't actually consider testing all the chemicals on the train. And so this probably could have been figured out sooner if government agencies in Ohio and the federal government had demonstrated transparency so that scientists like us and others could look at it and see not 4 weeks later or 6 weeks later, but maybe a week later that they needed to start testing for certain chemicals that they weren't looking for that were actually on the train. A few other notes you might have heard about. Governors and mayors across the US have prevented some of the waste from the area from entering their states for treatment and disposal. In Ohio, there was a truck that was hauling contaminated soil spilled onto the ground, and that caused local news. Multiple universities have been stepping in to provide support. Many are about to jump in to help people in Ohio and Pennsylvania. Evidence does indicate, based on everything we've seen, that Ohio deferred to Norfolk Southern to know and to recommend what chemicals they should be testing for in the environment. And that, as I mentioned, they weren't testing for all the chemicals they needed to be early on. Evidence also indicates, as Paula mentioned, that chemicals reached Negley and elsewhere in the air, and that wasn't in the plume model that was shown on TV and made public. To date, there's been no chemical flume footprint of the chemicals that were released and where they go and where the hot spots that hasn't been released yet. Though you have seen soil sampling plans be proposed, it's unclear how those can be proposed based on evidence if you don't have a plume model showing where the highest concentrations would be. It does also seem that US EPA, while they helped with the air quality modeling for lighting a rail car of vinyl chloride on fire for one rail car, it doesn't seem to be that they approved burning 5 rail cars, nor did they create a model to figure out what the maybe the evacuation zone is or the chemical impact area. And so that's part of the problem that still exists today, is some transparency on that. Also, the air testing efforts that were primarily done by US EPA failed to accurately document the acute chemical exposure risks indoors and for workers in the area. And this was even weeks after the disaster. As you may have heard, a Centers for Disease Control team, about half the team got sick by just being in the area. I became sick when I was there for a little bit. And so there's a number of other people, as well as residents and contractors, that did get sick being in the area, but the claims were that the air is safe. Clearly, the evidence wasn't there to support that in all conditions. And then US EPA and other organizations haven't yet disclosed some information. From a transparency standpoint, that would be a good thing. And there's still time to do the right thing and provide transparency and additional disclosure. So if you're looking for information about what we're doing, what we're finding, you can go to the Purdue University website, plumbingsafety.org. And we have been generating data, and this is all because the community asked for our help. We were able to go in there and help them. This is all a volunteer effort. No agencies have funded us. A group at Purdue University, Center for the Environment, did provide us the Institute for Sustainable Future. They provided us about $8,000, and we've racked up about $40,000 in bills so far. So any and all help is appreciated. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. And just to let you know, we are 2 months past the disaster, but it's still not over for people in Ohio and Pennsylvania. There's a lot of science to be done. There's a lot of public health protection to be done. And thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with you today.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew Welton, Paula Coelho. A very sobering presentation on a very sad set of incidents. Let's return immediately to some questions we have in the chat. And again, I do want to encourage all of you in the Q&A box. You can insert your questions, and we'll go through as many as we can. I'll start out with a couple of questions from Mike Jones, who's with the Santa Ana Water Board here in California. First, given the visible sheen, was oil and grease selected as a sampling parameter?
So that's a great question. I can tell you that the government agencies involved did not look for that. And we did not look for it because we don't have the capacity to do that here. So what we did was we throw the kitchen sink at it with everything that's in our kitchen. But I think there's an opportunity there for people to understand what that sheen is. Early on, some officials were saying that the sheen was butyl acrylate, and that's how they could confirm that contamination existed. But what we found out is that not many, but some of the officials that were saying things didn't actually have evidence to support what they were saying, which means that the scientists that were advising them needed to step up and kind of correct them.
And then a follow-up question, is data available for groundwater depth, velocity, and trajectory? If so, has that information been considered for nearby well monitoring?
So initially, officials just started taking samples, and there was no really general understanding of groundwater flow velocity. The depth, the groundwater table is like 3 feet in some places. When you open up the well caps, the water's like right there. And so since then, some hydrogeologists have been engaged. The state has brought in its people and started creating maps to estimate the groundwater flow velocity. And they don't believe that the municipal well field, which is to the east of the spill site, kind of away from the creek, is at risk because it's flowing from northwest to southeast. But really our concerns are the people that live by the creeks with wells, 20 to 100 feet away.
Very good. Shannon had a couple of questions, and I want to preface the first one with picking up on something that you noted, Andrew and Paula. You said that the water quality sampling that you did versus what the Ohio EPA did ended up with some different results. You found higher concentrations of certain contaminants. along those lines, Shannon's first question, have you been in communication with elected or regulatory authorities? And what do you think has been the biggest barriers to an effective response?
So I'll take this. I would say that the biggest barrier to an effective response is agencies and officials not realizing how complex of a situation they're running into, and then only finding out after they're overwhelmed about how complex it is. And so just to kind of give you an example, in Colorado after the Marshall Fire, 5 days after the Marshall Fire came through Boulder County, Colorado, we get a call for help. They said, we're overwhelmed. We don't necessarily know what we need to look for from a scientific perspective to protect public health, but we know we need help, and we know we need people that have done this before. In Ohio and Pennsylvania, you didn't see that. You saw a very agency-focused approach with federal agencies coming in and keeping a close hold on, themselves, and then the state agencies keeping a close hold on themselves, and then Norfolk Southern all, kind of huddling up together. And I think that's the problem. People don't generally understand the expertise and that they need until it's too late, where they've collected 200 well water samples and they're not looking for the chemicals that are in the wells. So it just takes the energy out of the response too, because then your elected leaders get on TV and start touting how great the response is when the foundation of it is cracked or not based on science. And so that's really one of the challenges that we saw.
Excellent. And then a second question, a follow-up. Have you yourselves been in communication with local residents in the area? And what are your impressions about how this incident has impacted public trust in the communities?
So I'm going to ask Paula to give her experience, because this is her first field response to a disaster. And so she probably has something
great,
more organic.
Yeah, I don't have like a very much political perspective about it, because I'm really not familiar with the approach from different agencies here. When we went there for the first time, we talked with some homeowners to see what is their perspective about what things happening. But I think that's very complicated situation, because since their lives changed, we can see a lot of people who had some plants, and they cut everything because they were so frustrated with the contamination. They couldn't plant anything at all anymore. They couldn't consume the things that they had. And some even people who had small production in the place, they don't have who to sell those products anymore, because they don't have the trust to who's gonna buy those things without be afraid of buying and consuming those contaminated products. So I think that from my perspective, that's a really sensitive situation, a very critical situation, because it's not just a health problems. It's an overall problem. It's a small community that is affected, that had their life changed with this accident.
Yeah, it's a pretty traumatic incident, as you underscore, Paula. Andrew, you were going to add?
Yeah, we still receive emails and calls and text messages from people that are impacted, and we try to do our best to incorporate that into data. So if somebody calls up and says, my house smells and it still smells like chemicals, the last trip we were there, we went to that house, so the person hadn't heard about it. So we we generally do what we can to go and try to investigate things that it seems that agencies are kind of cloistered together. They're not integrated. That, as I mentioned to you, it's like government directed response, not community engaged recovery. And so it's the government telling people what to do, and we know, and the air is safe, the water is safe, but there's no feedback loop that's pulling information into the system to then adjust the response. So we try to provide that feedback loop and also try to encourage the agencies to, like, please change what you're doing, because you're missing out on all this data that you need to then improve your response with.
Well, and that gets back to a remark that you made earlier about the data that's collected not really being processed or incorporated or fed back to the disaster responders in a good order of time, it sounds like.
Yeah, and I would just say one other thing too. One of the issues with disasters is there's two ways to go about it for faculty, right? One is we can collect the data, we can go back to the laboratory, and then we can stew on it and analyze it, and then put it through the peer review process, and then wait 6 to 9 months for it to be published, maybe. Or we can generate it and then gut check it with people, and then go and present it to people that can do something about the response now. And I don't think there's a right way or a wrong way, but this is the way we do it. And so some people will say, well, it's not peer reviewed. But look, you know, we generate it, we apply the methods that we've always used for the last 15 years. It works. And then we just put it out there. And if other people have something to say that will adjust their response, that's great. But we try to, like, be relevant today to help people for tomorrow.
Oh, that's an excellent point, and I think you would have a very sympathetic audience here at UC Irvine with that thought, Andrew. Obviously, we all have an obligation as scientists to seek to have our investigating results peer reviewed, but we also have a sort of a public service obligation to share what we know when we know it, particularly if it can prove to be of importance to emergency response. Speaking of sampling, I want to turn to a technical question. Bill Cooper, who's an emeritus professor here at UCI, and also an opportunity to answer this offline if you want. But Bill mentions that when we sample the surface microlayer in natural waters, we use something called the dipping glass technique. Literally dip a clean flat glass in the water, withdraw it, and then squeegee it to get an easy sample. It's not quantitative, but it's qualitative. Any thoughts? I know Bill would be happy to talk with you and Paul about this offline, but any thoughts about this as an expedient sampling method?
I would love to talk about that. I don't know much about it. I know the discovery that the sheen's not butyl acrylate or other things that everybody thought it was is important, because it's still there as of 2 weeks ago. And there was still free product kind of flowing around the streams 2 months after. So I think there's still opportunity to use new techniques. And if there's other researchers listening to this right now, you know, that can do this, feel free to try to figure it out, because that's a scientific issue that needs to be addressed that nobody's answered yet.
We've got a couple more minutes. I would welcome any additional questions in the Q&A, but in the meantime, I have a question. Just by coincidence, you mentioned Charleston, West Virginia early on, and I lived just outside of Charleston some years ago, west of the city. And of course, East Palestine, I went to school in Ohio and had some residence hall friends who were from that area. Are there some longer term lessons that we could draw from this incident with respect to the fact that many of these incidents, rail related, seem to occur in working class communities, poor areas of the country? Is there some question about how vigilant regulators are being in averting and or mitigating these incidents because of the communities that are at risk? Your thoughts on this?
So I would say that risk is defined as probability or the likelihood that something will happen versus the consequence of it happening. And so the probability of these types of disasters railway disasters or leaking tank disasters can be reduced by feedback loops that support, detection, reporting, oversight of those types of things. The consequence of it, so if it happens and there's a consequence, the consequence will be the same unless you change that part of the equation. And that is what I'm talking about with disasters across the country. If you have the right people at the table, you can make decisions very early on that protects the community from the consequences, sampling correctly, knowing where things went, proving things. But if you don't, then the consequence of not doing it right basically amplifies the negative side effects of that disaster, and then it extends it out. And so it reverberates, as we saw in East Palestine. It had national and even international implications. It not only just public health implications, economic implications, but political implications, public awareness implications across the globe about America. So I think it's in our nation's best interest and governors' best interest across the country and communities, whether you're a utility, to basically know when to bring people in as fast as possible to help square you up. So if you can't affect the probability, maybe you're a utility or a community, and you have no say in if that rail car or if the tanks or if something else happens, you can affect the consequence. And that's how I think you can reduce your risk.
That's a great observation. And unfortunately, we'll have to end it there. But I think this notion of engaging with the potentially affected publics, very, very good point and a great presentation. Andrew Welton and Paula Coelho, both of Purdue University, thank you for really an excellent presentation. Again, this is recorded and we'll be in a position also to post your excellent slides on our site as well. So I want to thank you both. And I want to close this colloquium by mentioning that our last colloquium for Water UCI of academic year 2023 will be in June. Stay tuned. We'll have announcements coming out on email blogs. It's entitled Cows, Crops, and the Colorado: Thirsty Practices in a Time of Crisis. And it will be not only our last colloquium of the year, but it will be an in-person colloquium. So we look forward to seeing many of you there. Again, let's thank you, Andrew and Paula. Great presentation. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Bye now.